highly respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer. Today I'm joined by Austrian activist and identity movement leader, Martin Sellner. Martin, welcome to the show. I've explained before, I'm trying not to sound like a stupid American here and say, hi, Martin, what's going on? So Martin, how are you doing today?
I'm very fine. Thanks for the invitation and thanks for pronouncing my name the Austrian way, Martin Sellner.
We're trying to hear. I did take some German lessons in school, so I have some idea of the correct pronunciation in German. Of course, I will obviously not be 100% accurate all the time. But going straight into the show, there's been a lot happening in both America and Europe over the last few weeks. And the first thing I want to talk about is Antifa. The far left group has become a major subject in the United States due to their role in the recent riots. The group has even lent a hand to Seattle's Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, which has declared independence from the United States and saying that it's its own country, even though it's only controlling like 6 or 7 blocks in the city of Seattle. Martin, you've interacted a lot with Antifa. Why don't you talk a little bit about the group's origins, how they operate in Europe, and how they've targeted you? Because you've become like almost public enemy number 1 to Antifa in Austria.
That's true. They've not only burned down my car, but also my parents' car once in their hometown.
And that's not a laughing matter, but that's like almost insane.
Yeah.
How that's
on a regular basis, they put posters out with my name. So the Antifa exists for a while in Austria, Germany, and Europe. Especially they're quite strong in Germany, but also in a lot of French cities. And since the Second World War, they have been able to grow their infrastructures. They got money from several political parties, and they are something like a tolerated terrorist group on the street that is enforcing this soft totalitarianism from the left. So when economic isolation, social isolation, and so on doesn't work, then you become a goal for the Antifa. And just like in the United States, it consists and it recruits itself mostly from young bourgeois, left-wing, bored students. And I think it's very interesting that something that is very usual in European politics now also, in a way, took over in the United States on the streets. So I think it's kind of a Europeanization of the American political scene that Antifa also is now prevalent there. What's very important, I think, to understand for everybody who listens is that Antifa is a Bolshevist communist group. They have their roots back in the German turf wars and street wars between the NSDAP and the Communist Party. And while the National Socialist Party had the Sturmabteilung, the SA, on the streets, the Communist Party fighting for Stalin had the anti-fascist Red Front troops. And today, of course, after Second World War, there's no Nazi party anymore. There's no SA anymore, but the Antifa is still there fighting for left-wing totalitarianism. And their whole political aim is just terror. So outing people, attacking people, hurting them physically, hurting their infrastructure, burning down their cars, so that the price to get involved in right-wing politics always stays high. That's the job of Antifa. So they're basically a terrorist organization that has been accepted, that has been tolerated by the states in Europe.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've seen in America reacting to this European phenomenon, and you're very correct, we didn't really have this. We of course had like small Antifa groups, but I mean, unless you're going to like metal shows or anything like that, it was something that normal people never interacted with. It was just right after President Trump's or Donald Trump's election in 2016, we began seeing black masks, people who were calling them anti-fascists and Antifa, and using all the slogans and regalia that we've seen in Europe, who are just like suddenly appeared and started causing riots if there was some right-winger coming to speak, or even mainstream conservatives having an event, they were trying to disrupt it. It's something that has just rapidly developed over the last 4 years. This is something that you didn't really see unless you were in certain music subcultures at all in America. And the one thing that with American reaction to it, when they hear the word Antifa, or they're like, anti-fascist, that's what our troops in World War II are fighting against. So they all like have this, like any time that Republicans or conservatives complain about Antifa, liberals on Twitter will say like, here's anti-fascist, and it's American troops storming the beaches at Normandy. They always do this every time, and they don't they imagine that anyone like liberals and conservatives, everyone can be Antifa. And they'll even like say stuff like Abraham Lincoln was Antifa, which makes absolutely no sense at all because they weren't fascists in the 1860s. But I think in Europe, there's a better understanding that this is a far left phenomenon that has been tied to communists. I mean, the communists started it in the 1930s. They directly created the first Antifa group. The East German government declared itself an anti-fascist state. It was anti-fascism was its ideology, hiding its brutal totalitarian methods, but it was saying it was all for anti-fascism. And there is a better understanding, maybe I'm wrong, that maybe liberals also in Europe will also have these cringe posts saying that the normal, World War II troops fighting in, whatever, were anti-fascist as well. But there is a clear connection between that and far left groups. And do you think that most Europeans understand that when they see them, they see these as communists and far left radicals versus then ordinary or normal people who are just trying to stand up for classical liberal values?
No, I think Antifa clearly is seen in Europe as a very left-wing organization, but also and especially in Germany, they try to normalize it. So you have a lot of politicians who openly are in solidarity with Antifa. And also after Trump wanted to declare them a terrorist organization, you had just the same posts by the left liberals in Europe, in Germany, in Austria, of troops landing in France. But of course, it's completely stupid, and
I'm glad that cringe is a universal phenomenon. It's not just restricted to America.
The worst cringe in Europe is by right-wing people. I don't want to use the term boomer. It's overused, but mostly elderly people who don't really have an ideological education. They then counter the Antifa by calling them the real fascists. So Antifa, the real fascists, and they're the red fascists, and so on. You have the brown fascists and the red fascists. And of course, this is also stupid because they're just Bolshevists, and just because you're against Antifa, it doesn't make you necessarily a fascist or a liberal. It just makes you an anti-communist, and you just reject this kind of communist street warfare. But of course, today the Antifa, in a way, if you really look at the function, they don't really have any communist organization anymore. The main target is to fight against fascism, and in a way, they've been co-opted into the whole liberal globalist agenda by just becoming the street forces of political correctness. So that's, I think, why Antifa is being allowed to exist. You could easily crush them in Europe as a terrorist organization if the state really wanted to. So at the same time, while Antifa has in every bigger city an autonomous youth center, and they have their own Antifa band, they have their own little subcultural economic sphere where they can prosper. At the same time, there's a very severe and very brutal persecution of any patriotic organization in Europe. And I think Antifa is just being allowed to exist, having the strange communist pipe dreams that never will take reality, by the elites, because they know exactly that the Antifa is able to paralyze and to occupy and basically steal the time from the real patriotic opposition.
Yeah, and they're primarily used as Dobermans against the real dissidents. They're just attack dogs that they stick on people that the elites don't like. And you were pointing this out, alluded to this a bit, is that what we're seeing in Seattle here in America, some people have told me that there's several cities in Germany and other places in Europe where they have their own like autonomous zones where they control all these blocks, and I guess the police don't really go in, and if outsiders go in, they'll be assaulted and whatnot. And that's something that's a very strange phenomenon in America. In America, we're like have this like weird, that's very repulsive to us to have these like zones that like just in the middle of the city. It's run by a completely other state, but this appears to be a more common phenomenon in Europe. And you also were saying that this is a very good point of saying in America is that these people aren't really advocating for left-wing goals. They're not really going for a left-wing cause. What they primarily do is just try to shut down other people. They're not really trying to shut down banks or evils of capitalism or anything like that. They're just going after, political dissidents who don't have any power, who actually do challenge the system, and they're just trying to ensure that they can't host events, they can't be on Twitter, and they can't even like go home at night with having their car blown up and stuff like this. They're not really, they're not what they're doing is not supporting like the coming communist state or anything like that. It's just ensuring that people, neoliberals and people who are, center left, and enjoy their lives without having to worry about far right extremists or anything like that. And it is like funny that the current riots do show them advocating for a cause that is separate from just shutting down dissidents. They are trying to defund the police and abolish the police and reduce their presence in the cities, which is a far left goal that does ensure some of their objectives are accomplished. But at the same time, this is only being successful because neoliberal elites also want to defund the police and abolish the police because they feel like crime has gone to such a dramatic low in America, or historic low, especially over the last 50 years, that they don't have to worry about crime at all, that they can just deal without police and we'll just call up a social worker and everything like that. So this is a goal that it's successful because the center left supports it, not necessarily because the Antifa are so effective in agitating for that. Exactly. And do you think that's the same as that there's not really any political goals being accomplished here? It's just about shutting down people that they oppose, people who are without power.
I think it's they still have the political goals, but if you look at the state of the postmodern left, they are so incapable of creating any organization because they're so overwhelmed by all the new speech rules and all the new revolutionary subjects and the intersectionality, like who's the highest in the victim scale, and then all these strange rituals, So if the real Bolshevists, those workers' parties who were very masculine, very warrior-like, would see them, they would be just a laughing stock for them. So I think they're not really able to create anything and build anything. You just need to look at the mugshots of those people actually hiding behind these Antifa masks. So I think they are in the current mental state of the left, of their situation, not really able to organize any real communist ground game and groundwork. So the only real function and role is to occupy and keep the opposition, the right wing, the real opposition, busy. But I have to say, it's also very interesting to follow the development of the Antifa in the United States now, because it's quite young. And I think soon there'll be some ideological splits. For example, in the German Antifa, there was a big war within Antifa groups. Some were classical communists, anti-imperialists, pro-Palestine and against Israel. And then you had an Antifa organization, the anti-German Antifa, which basically won this war, which is very pro-Zionist and just ethnomasochistic against German. So I think also in those questions, many other questions, because intersectionality creates all these divisions, there might soon be some splits in the American Antifa as well, when maybe the common enemy, Trump and the alt-right, is not so important and big to them anymore.
Yeah, we're already seeing that in the autonomous zone in Seattle, is that there's some black rapper who's also apparently an Airbnb super landlord, has taken control of the police, the volunteer police force in the autonomous zone, is just beating up the Antifa who are pissing him off or whatever. And he's just doing this, and all they can do is just complain on the internet that they don't have, that this is somebody who's taking people from the streets and is dominating the goofy white leftists who are in there, and they really have no language or way to oppose it, that this is just the street culture that is taking over when they try to create spaces that people like this guy, I think his name's Roz Simone, just take over and then run the place. And there's basically no difference between that and the ordinary ghettos, except that there's some political dress to what they're doing, but it's essentially the same, is that just street gang lords are the ones running their places, that they're not, that the real political activists are not the ones in charge. And you were saying this a little bit earlier about how President Trump has called for them to be declared a domestic terror group. Do you support that, or do you think that would actually end up somehow hurting right-wingers in America more?
I think it's a good move. Also, actually, I'm very grateful for that. Although I have my criticism of Trump because it also created this debate in Europe, because Antifa definitely is a terrorist organization, because the whole goal is to create a random acts of violence against the political opposition in order to shut down the freedom of speech, freedom of association. And that's a textbook definition of terror. They try to prevent every demonstration. They also did this in Charlottesville in America, and in Germany and Austria. Every patriotic organization and demonstration you have basically is being attacked by Antifa in that way, and being shut down, unless if you would use really violence and force against them to pave your way, which of course in that sense is also not possible. So I really think they should and have to be persecuted as what they are, and they are a terrorist organization, definitely and absolutely. I think it's really very revealing for modern democracies that they allow something like this to happen. That in Germany you have, as you've mentioned, several autonomous zones and centers where the Antifa basically can do what they want and attack police, and it's just because the state in this very area decides not to enforce its laws. It's this classical notion of the anarcho-tyranny that you are surely aware of, and you clearly can see it with Antifa. I also think the FBI now came out and said that right-wing terrorists, alt-right people are the biggest threat of violence. This zone that you was talking about in Seattle, I think it wasn't even acknowledged by the authorities. So Antifa basically really can do what they want.
The governor in that state acted like he had never heard of this problem, even though the police are clearly aware that the law and order is broken down in the middle of their largest city. So it's clearly an issue that the governor should acknowledge. And you were saying this with the FBI, is that our federal government still believes that right-wing extremists and white nationalists or whatever are the biggest threat to the country. Yet, we're seeing with these riots is that far left extremists were able to organize and to take over entire cities and burn down buildings and encourage looting. Now, as I've said in a few previous episodes, and I've said in tweets, that these are not, Antifa are not the majority of the people. It's the general street people. A lot of them are non-white, black and everything else, who make up the majority, but they don't seem like those people are the leaders, that they're being directed by left-wing extremists who are like, hey, let's go burn down this police station. Hey, let's topple this statue. I think that the left-wing extremists and Antifa have been able to direct and lead these riots to be more destructive than what they would have already been. I think they would have just been minor looting episodes in a couple of cities, and police would have maintained control, but the Antifa radicalized them and directed them towards institutions that they saw as part of the power structure or racism or whatever. There is that element there that they are like organized, and they created these riots, and the FBI is still like, well, I guess we believe right-wing extremists are a bigger threat because, they make a more convenient enemy than left-wing Antifa.
They try to blame it on white nationalists riot at the beginning. Absolutely crazy. But I think it's very important also to understand that's how Marxism works. They always are looking for a revolutionary subject. So they're looking for division. They're looking for a certain group that they can somehow take and use as the subject and the hero of their revolution. And of course, since the working class basically abandoned them, they have been looking, and the same as Antifa is trying to use those ethnic tensions in the United States and the black movement as a revolutionary subject for Marxist communist change in Europe. They're trying to use the refugees, but this of course creates all the funniest clashes, because this the mindset of the classic black ghetto gangster rapper, as we see in this zone in Seattle, doesn't, of course, fit into this whole safe space college mindset of the Antifa. And we had really the craziest and funniest incidents in Germany, where there was an Antifa club and disco, for example, in Leipzig, Konnewitz, and they let in all the refugees. And then after half of a year, there was an open letter by the staff that was complaining because of sexual violence, and so it doesn't
imagine that. Yeah, no, this always happens with their trying to represent people who ultimately are going to be like, what is like the normal people are like, what is transgender? Like, there's a hilarious photo of from New York where there's a guy who's, or we want to use the proper pronouns. There's a transgender person in a dress, and this person has a beard and like long hair. And there's like he's like standing up and he's got his fist in the air. And there's a black person who's just staring in disbelief right next to him, who's got the knee on the ground. He's like, what the hell is standing next to me? And this is like they're like, what is this stuff? Like, we're just out, like, even though they might have a problem with police brutality, that doesn't, and like think that the whole system is racist, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be down with gender pronouns and believing that some person with a beard isn't actually a woman. They're not actually going to be supportive of that. And there's already, as these seen in the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone in Seattle, these differences are already starting to emerge. But going back to your point about the domestic terror group, is that in America, we're a little bit different. I know that in Germany and Austria, it's much easier to classify domestic political groups as, I don't believe you use the term domestic terror group, but there's threats against the state, or well, what's the term that, I know you have a term in a lot of these states where it's essentially this synonymous with domestic terror that they use against normal political groups, and they use that much more frequently in Europe. In America, we don't officially classify extremist groups as that because of, you know, our civil liberties and everything like that. The Constitution, there becomes constitutional questions there. So even though the federal government has invested a lot of resources in going after people like the Ku Klux Klan, militias, Black Panthers, all these groups, none of them were officially designated domestic terror groups, even though they were investing resources in that. If they did, you were able to declare Antifa a domestic terror group, it would open a lot of doors for more persecution for the right. With that, that's not me saying that the FBI and the Department of Justice do need to invest more resources into it, but it does open up a Pandora's box. What happens next if you're declaring this group a domestic terror group? Then they could declare, then Democrats, especially if they got in charge, would use that against pretty much everybody. I mean, they would have loved to call the Tea Party a domestic terror group during the Obama administration. They would love to call, you know, the National Rifle Association a domestic terror group. Even anti-vaxxers or anybody else, much less people like me or, you know, other American nationals, they would love to call pretty much the entire right a domestic terror group, and they would have the moral clout to do that because all the journalists would be out there carrying water for their agenda. So there is like some problems with it. I think it is good that Trump is calling them a domestic terror group. It is good that it seems that the Attorney General, Bill Barr, wants to take them seriously. But there are problems with declaring them a domestic terror group. And as somebody who actually went on Fox News in 2017 to talk about how Antifa is a domestic terror group and how they should be declared, I actually think that it opens up, it would end up hurting the right more just by the example and precedent that it would set. So I know it's different in Europe, which you can just explain that a little bit about how the classifications there are similar to what would be, you know, what we would call a domestic terror group.
Yeah, we have a bit of a different system. It's way easier in Germany and in Austria to ban an organization, and also in France and other states just to disband an organization. It doesn't actually have to be a terroristic organization, but still they're already using this against us. For example, there's been a big investigation in Austria and also several house raids last year against myself and Generation Identity for building or supporting a terrorist organization because of the terror attack in New Zealand. You know, the basis for this was just that I received a donation from the shooter now 2 years ago. So they're very quick to start those investigations. I completely understand your position. I think maybe in America you're absolutely right, because you really have freedom of speech. We in Europe, we don't have freedom of speech. We have certain speech laws, a lot of banned symbols, banned words, banned opinions, actually. So I think the repression against the right and right-wing groups in Europe, especially Germany and Austria and the Germanosphere, cannot even get much worse. So everything that would be possible against Antifa as well would be good here. But I completely understand that in America, freedom of speech is protecting you, and everything that is done against the left in the end will come back against the right. That's actually a fair statement.
Yeah, and the one good thing we have in America is that we don't have the state persecution that a lot of people in Europe, that pretty much everywhere in Europe has to deal with. I mean, we have similar levels of repression, but it's from the private sector. It's from, corporations, where if you're, like a certain tweet, you can get fired from your job. I'm sure that there's some cases in Europe. I'm not sure if it's as extreme where we're seeing now, especially in the mass hysteria over the riots, that if anybody is like, well, I don't want to mourn George Floyd, they risk losing their job, and they could just be some dude working in Oklahoma, and they're like a nobody, but they'll just get fired for it anyway. And there is in the private sector, it's repression from corporations and the media that you really have to worry about, and they can effectively ensure that you're unemployable for life, just for having a certain political opinion. I'm sure that this is very similar in Europe. Maybe it might be more extreme here in America. But, to move on a little bit of a different topic, is talking about your group that is suffering from state persecution. The Identitarians, despite all the pressure that they get from the state and all the opposition, they are one of the largest patriotic youth groups in Europe. And they do many great demonstrations, and they have a strong presence throughout pretty much in every country. They're in France, Germany, Austria, et cetera, et cetera. Can you explain to our audience what the Identitarians are about? What is your ideology, and what are your goals with the movement?
Yeah, we are, as you said already, a European youth movement. So focus especially on Western continental Europe. We have been active since 2012 and been able to set up groups in most of those Western European countries. And our idea is to create non-violent patriotic activism that follows a bit the style of Greenpeace, Attack, and other left-wing activist movements. Our ideology and our main goal is to stop the Great Replacement, to put a focus on the replacement migration, Islamization in Europe, and to create an awareness for that, and also to create a possible political debate about that, to influence political parties to talk about this, bring those issues up with disruptive but peaceful activism. That's our goal. We try to do it as professionally and as united as possible all across over Europe. And as you said, in spite of a lot of repression, of course, the press slandering us, the tactics of disintegration, as you mentioned them, banning us from Facebook. Our logo has been declared a forbidden symbol on Facebook, banning dozens of bank accounts, PayPal, Stripe, etc. Of course, in spite of that, we're still active, and we're still able to maintain a certain level of visible, peaceful resistance against our opponent's agenda. I think it's very important, and I also think it's really the way to go within the current system that we live in.
Yeah, and you were mentioning a lot of the slandering that you receive from the media, and a lot of the very fake news here in the English-speaking world compares you guys a lot to the American alt-right, which not very many people, hardly anybody calls themselves alt-right anymore. It's kind of a dead meme at this point. But how would you say you are different from what the American alt-right is perceived, or what you think it is?
I think it's a bit complicated because, as you said, it's a kind of umbrella term that was used for people like you, but also people like Milo Yiannopoulos, if I'm pronouncing correctly. So very, very different people.
I think Yiannopoulos might be, but it's
sorry,
close
yeah.
enough.
Yeah, but so I think it's very very complicated. I think it's the easiest way to describe the term is but to describe by what it's not. So not mainstream neocon conservatism Inc. But generation identity, first and foremost, is a form of action and is a certain tactic and strategy. And I think that really what makes us special, that we try to create this disruptive activism, representative active, peaceful confrontations. The peak of it was, I think, the Defend Europe actions and campaigns in the Mediterranean Sea and in the French Alps. And I think that's what's making Generation Identity unique, that we really try to perform this high-tier, big and very spectacular actions and campaigns.
Okay. Yeah, and as it became even a story in America, is that I believe it was in 2017, you guys were, or 2018, if correct me on the year, is that you were trying to intercept some of the boats that were coming through that were being sponsored by NGOs, and were raising awareness towards how all these like huge NGOs and nonprofits were bringing over these migrants against the will of the people, and you were going out there and essentially staging a protest against them. But a very unique protest. I don't, we very rarely see naval activism in our country, so it's very unique, and it generated a lot of coverage. And it was just the right message to send, that there's all these corrupt organizations backed by billionaires who are bringing in literal boatloads of migrants against the will of the people, and you guys were raising awareness for that. So you guys do many great things about that. Now, and another question about what differentiates you from another group. There's several nationalist parties throughout Europe. We got the National Rally in France, Freedom Party in Austria, Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, Swedish Democrats, et cetera, et cetera. What makes you different from these parties? And do you even see a difference between them? Or do you just see that this is an activism and that they're just focused on electoral politics?
First and foremost, as you said, yes, it's kind of a division of labor, just like you have Greenpeace and the Green Party. But I think it's also a bit more. It's a very different strategic understanding. I, for myself, and I think most of generation identity activists don't believe that power really lies within the parliaments and the state. Power lies somewhere completely different. It's a metapolitical understanding of power that we have. And we think that all the resources that we have, all the people, all the money, all the time that we still have and that still is left, should be totally focused on the metapolitical sphere, because that's where change actually happens. You see it now with the Black Lives Matter movement, how they're also changing with other movements, grassroots movements, the Democratic Party, and therefore also changing in the long term the politics in America. So I think that the right-wing populism, the parliamentary patriotism has utterly and totally failed in Europe, because in the last decades, since the 1990s when it started, it has achieved nothing. It hasn't slowed down the population replacement at all. It hasn't slowed down and not reverted the social disintegration and the shift of the Overton window to the left. So I really think that we're having a different strategy and a different approach than those political parties. And I also really think that what has happened during the last years shows that our approach is more correct, more right, and more important.
Yeah, you guys have had a lot of problems, or some, I don't know necessarily the problems might be the things, but there's been a little different or divide between you and the Freedom Party in Austria, is that last year when all the controversy emerged about the supposed terrorist nature of Identitarians, the Freedom Party threw you guys under the bus. And even though the center-right coalition that they were part of, Kurtz and all eventually threw the Freedom Party under the bus, even though they had cucked on you when it comes to you guys. So and now that they're out of power and they seem to be declining in the polls, that they're not doing very successfully. Meanwhile, the center right is having the Green Party and its coalition. And I believe they even have a Green minister who now oversees the Interior, or the Department of the Interior, or whatever the I'm probably getting the name wrong, but the department that oversees immigration and a lot of the security forces is now run by a Green minister who's very opposed to the Identitarian. So it seems that in Austria, at least, that the nationalist political party failed in a lot of ways by trying to play the political game too much, and eventually that game played them.
Exactly. It's they got into political power just like Trump got into political power, but still they had the whole deep state and the media against them. So from the beginning, it was an uphill battle. They were constantly defending themselves, trying to please the mainstream media. They were always in the defense and never in the offense. And of course, they got into power because of 2015, because of the shock of the migrant wave. And after this shock faded away, also the popularity went away. And you just saw that this rise and this success was very short-lived. And now, yes, the right-wing Patriot Party in Austria is in a deep crisis. Our Minister of Justice is a migrant herself, and she's a sworn enemy of all patriotic movements and of generation identity. And she was brought into power by the Conservative Party. But I think in the end, on the long term, that there will be a swing back to the right in Austria. I think it's also a very special and very complex issue, Austrian politics, maybe not so easy to understand for the American listener. What I think is important is that whether Salvini or in the UK, the Brexit Party, UKIP, or in Austria, the Freedom Party, or even in Denmark, the right-wing parties there, they were not really able during the last decades to change anything about mass migration. And we have the same problem as in the United States. We have the ethnic vote. So demography is changing the fabric and the populace who is voting. And within the next decades, democratic majorities will not be possibly demographically. So demography will eat up democracy. And that's also the same problem that we have in many European countries. In front, we have Belgium, France, and the UK, of course. But Germany, Austria, Netherlands, Italy are also following close up in this ethnic vote that will destroy democracy.
And we're seeing a lot of what happened with the Freedom Party going on with the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, AfD, that they're in the midst of a kind of civil war within their party. The moderates are really cracking down on the nationalists, forcing the closure of the right-wing Der Flügel faction. Hopefully I pronounced it correctly. And the party, even though Der Flügel has been the most successful element of the party, I mean, they're like either the second largest party in several German states, yet they've decided to close them down because the German state or Justice Department decided that they're a threat to the state. So they had to close them down. And now they're kicking out nationalist representatives who've been very successful at organizing the party and advancing their cause. They're kicking them out in order to please the mainstream press. What do you make of the recent developments in the AfD? And do you think that this signals that there will be a new nationalist party emerging that is more authentic to what was winning the AfD seats in East Germany and elsewhere? Or do you think that this signals that there's possibly an end to a mainstream nationalist party in Germany?
That's a very good question. I really hope that the AfD will stay in the hands of real, authentic patriots, and that all these liberal people will, these conservative people will leave the AfD, because it has already happened twice. Lucke, the founder of the party, who was very liberal conservative, his own issue really was to leave the euro, the currency union. And he left the party because it got too patriotic, too nationalistic for him. And then two other people, Frauke Petri and a few others, also left the party because of an internal power struggle. And again, it's happened now for the third time that liberal conservatives who want to turn the AfD into a softer version of the CDU are trying to kick out the very successful Eastern German AfD politicians. You have to imagine in Eastern Germany, like in Thuringia and Saxony, AfD gets like 24-25%. And in Western Germany, it very often gets only 6 or 7%. So that's a huge divide in this party. And the reason for that is, of course, in Germany, you have the Secret Service that publishes every year a list of organizations that are being watched by the Secret Service. And they're now threatening to also put the AfD on that watch list, which has severe consequences. It means as a teacher or as a soldier or a policeman, you're not allowed to join the party. The party can be watched by the secret state. They're allowed, Secret Service, they're allowed to infiltrate the party. They're allowed to listen to the phone calls. And this is the threat under which the AfD is basically disassembling itself. Because this liberal conservative cucks, they say, we have to kick this guy out. We have to disband our youth organization. We have to distance ourselves from generation identity to prevent being put on this watch list. But of course, it's being used as a basically a tool. They are appealing to their fear, and they hope that the AfD will disassemble and basically kill itself under this fear. But I hope, and I'm very optimistic, that in this internal party conflict, the patriotic, authentic people will again be successful, because as you already said it, they are the successful parties. So in the East, the AfD is a real force. In the West, it's quite weak. But I think that the Eastern authentic patriotic section will be successful.
Yeah, as you mentioned, the German state service is pretty aggressive in trying to keep down nationalist groups or anything that might be successful. And there had been a few nationalist parties in Germany, but they were so extreme and outside the fringe that they weren't very successful. And as it turned out, they were controlled by the federal government. The National Democratic Party, they've tried to shut it down several times. At any time they shut it down, they're like, all the extremists are actually federal informants, and they always have a list. And it's like, this guy was saying these things that are threats to the state. It turns out he's on the state payroll, and the state was controlling the more extreme factions. And I think the state feels very threatened by the AfD because it's not run by federal informants. It is a party that appeals to a wide swath of German voters. Even it seems like a lot of the CDU voters seem open to their ideas and want their party to be, tougher on immigration and everything like that. And thus the German state now has to, crack down hard on them because they feel that this is a tremendous threat to the prevailing order. They would prefer that the federal informants continue to represent the nationalist right in Germany.
Totally. The reason for that, why the AfD was successful compared to many other experiments, was that at the beginning it was just a mere party about economy. So it was against giving money to the Greek people, and it was against the currency union and against these high payments that Germany had to pay, a bit like the Brexit movement. And that gave a lot of bourgeois people from the center, the excuse to vote this party. And then after a few years, they all realized, we also have in common that we are against mass migration. And then from this position of power and from after having amassed a big amount of people, then they became quite patriotic, a bit like the Austrian Freedom Party or the Italian Lega. And that's how the AfD got so big. All the other small parties that formed under the topic of stop Islamization, stop mass migration were stamped out from the beginning. And of course, the fear of the liberal conservatives in the AfD is that if the AfD would be watched and put on this watch list, then it would disassemble again. It would follow the fate of these old failed experiments, would be infiltrated again, and soon shift into a very fringe right-wing section. So that's basically their argument. That's their tactic for their strategy of kicking out people, pleasing to the Secret Service and to the mainstream media. But I think that the AfD is already strong and big enough, and also rooted enough in the center of Germany that they could even withstand being put on this watch list.
And going back to a point that you were talking about a bit earlier about the tremendous amount of censorship that you guys face, this is also something that's that American nationalists also have to deal with. That tech censorship is a major issue for the right throughout the world, throughout the West right now, and it's definitely making a serious impact. And I think you are one of the more censored people out there. You are banned from Facebook and Instagram. Your wife, Brittany Sellner, who some of my listeners will remember as Brittany Pettibone, was even forced to delete photos she had of you on Instagram to retain her account. Like even showing a photo of you on Instagram is forbidden. It's not allowed, which is pretty insane to most people's understanding. But they've also done this similar to Alex Jones and others, where if you even share a link from InfoWars on Facebook, you risk having your account banned. And this can be just from some normal Joe, not average Joe. This is not necessarily a big account that even sharing photos or links from these people risks having your account banned. So how has the censorship affected your movement and your ability to organize, and how have you overcome it?
So of course, as you said, it was a big blow because that's the modern digital agora, the modern public space, Facebook and all these areas. And in 2018, our movement had a major and global breakthrough with Big Defend Europe actions, and then the response was to be totally deleted by social media. You can try it if you post a Lambda movement's logo on Instagram. Normally, an algorithm deletes that post. I think Instagram and Facebook, they have just a second filter of this kind for the logo of Al-Qaeda and maybe for swastikas. I don't know, but it was really a severe blow. Then all the bank accounts were deleted. I had recently my 19th bank account deleted in the last 3 years. So they only last for a few months. But that just means that you have to always be moving. So it's a bit like a political guerrilla. A guerrilla movement also doesn't have a real base because they can't because of artillery fire. If you allow me this military metaphor, it means you cannot really build up lasting structures, but you have to always have like 3 bank accounts in reserve and create one movement after another, one association after another. And you always have to be like dynamic, flexible, and you just have to be able to always change your strategy. And when one thing breaks down, you just switch to the next.
I mean, I think there has been some success stories even in America, which I don't think we've had we fortunately have not yet had the extreme extent of financial deplatforming that you have. Of course, people are banned from PayPal, Stripe, and Patreon, and et cetera, those platforms, but it's not necessarily that banks have been denying people. There have been a few cases of banks and credit cards denying people. It's not been that widespread in America yet, and most people have been able to use banking and stuff. They've certainly, I don't know anybody who is on their 19th bank account yet, which is just a very extreme way of doing this. But it does show that you're still going strong, that there is ways to survive. And there are people in America, even though that they're taken off YouTube or PayPal and everything else, they're still able to survive. They're still able to get their message out there. Just this week, Nick Fuentes, who was banned from YouTube last year, was attaining over 17,000 live viewers on his show on DLive. And I believe that's higher than he ever attained on YouTube. So that you're able to, if you find an alternative platform, you can still survive and get your message out there. They can't shut down everybody. Another example is Alex Jones, InfoWars, that they've set up their own platform, and they're still probably just as influential as they were before, even though you can't share their links on Facebook and everything like that. They're still getting their message out there. And the Identitarians were recently getting out their messages that you guys were going out to the Black Lives Matter protests throughout Europe, which is a crazy idea that they're even there in the first place, and spreading a message that was countering it. Now, to Americans, it seems a little, as I was saying, a little insane that Europeans, tens of thousands of them, are protesting or even rioting on what is a very American issue. What do you make of this, and what do you think of what's motivating the people who are out there and saying Black Lives Matter in places like Vienna and Berlin? Like, what is really driving them to go out there to protest on what should be an American issue?
I think what's really driving them is what you call woke capital right now. It's all this Instagram, Amazon, Sony PlayStation, all of them basically told them they have to go protest on the streets. I think Rockstar even shut down the server, so even the gamers couldn't play their favorite video games anymore.
The real oppression, by the way. This is the gamer lives matter. This is the real movement we need.
Totally. So it was actually really like another Gamergate, but it worked. So a certain potential of brainwashed people, of course, went to the streets. But it didn't shock me at all. If you look at the last days of the the anti-fascist German Democratic Republic, they also were able to fill the streets with all of the young, fanatic communist activists. But the crazy thing is that the same discourse of structural racism and microaggressions is now also imported to Europe. So everything, we get everything from America. First McDonald's, and now structural racism and POC and this whole Black Lives Matter movement. And now they even want to tell us that we have to teach about Black history in Austria and about the contributions of Black people to Austrian, German, European history. Completely crazy, but it worked. And we had in Vienna one of the largest protests of the last years. Thousands of people, tens of thousands of people breaking all the Corona rules, swamping the streets. And we, of course, decided to at least show a little sign of disagreement to this narrative, and especially to the import of this protest that's basically based on lies and misinformation. So we decided to confront them with a banner with the slogan "Our Lives Matter," and with the names of certain European and also American victims of imported criminality, from Catherine Steinle to Maria Ladenburger and Tommy Lind. And this triggered them hardly. And I think it's very important to do this kind of confrontations, to not let them completely dominate this narrative and the public debate.
Yeah, and in America, even a lot of people who are going out and trying to counter protest or say that they don't agree with the protesters are losing their jobs and getting arrested. So it is a very bold move there. I hope that none of that is happening in Austria and Germany, but in America, that there is like very serious consequences for them, or you, of course, get assaulted. That is actually a very risky move to go out and counter the protesters. But of course, people need to, that they need to show that not everybody agrees with them and they can't take over the whole country and impose their vision on our nation. And the funny thing, you were saying this about Black History Month for Austria, is like, I'm not quite sure who you would be recruiting for that measure. I mean, in America, there's a popular myth that Beethoven was Black, and that this actually inspired a huge row back in the late 80s at Stanford University. One of the first college political correctness outrages, that there was a disagreement over whether Beethoven was Black, said between these students, and these students decided to draw blackface on Beethoven, and this created a huge uproar. And lost in that was saying that how insane it is to think that Beethoven is Black. But you will talk to many African Americans here in our country, and they will say that Beethoven is Black. So maybe German and Austrian schools may decide he's Black, or maybe Brahms, maybe Goethe was actually a quarter Black. I don't know what they'll necessarily decide is there, but it is that the whole world, the whole West, has to resemble America and have its same ideology, its same neuroses, its same hang-ups about its history. And now that has to be there. And the one thing I worry about is that we're seeing it all throughout our country, that people are just tearing down monuments and statues to things that they declare are racist. We're seeing people just drag Christopher Columbus statues and throwing them into a lake. We're seeing, even people who should be considered anti-racist heroes like Abraham Lincoln, they're defacing that and writing white supremacists on their statues. And I've seen this, of course, is happening in the UK, where anyone who's been tied to the slave trade or to colonialism, there's targeting. They took some, I forget the name, somebody who was very involved in the slave trade in Bristol. They dragged him and threw him in the river. They all celebrated that. And they even went after Winston Churchill, declaring him a racist at a statue. So do you think that this is going to that you will start seeing similar things in Europe, where they're going to go after monuments and statues to things that the left decides is politically incorrect for the current era, and that they need to destroy them as well?
It's already happening. The Antifas of Vienna, left wing of Austria and Germany, they've already presented a wish list of statues they want to be removed. Mostly, of course, of people and artists that they consider to be too nationalistic. And there's already been a statue defaced in Vienna. That's totally happening. It's really showing the sign of the Cultural Revolution in China. And that's even more, I think, a reason to do some actions against it. And I just wanted to come back to what you said before, that it's dangerous legally and physically to confront people on the streets. And I completely agree. I think it's very good that people, like most right-wingers, stay at home and don't go on the street and don't have brawls with Antifa, because then they would all blame it on white nationalists, and we don't really have anything to win in such situations. But I think if you're creative and you create a peaceful signs of resistance, then you can actually do a lot of good. So what I saw in all these Black Lives Matter protests in the United States, there were a lot of hotels around. So if you just book a hotel room, that goes next to a protest line, and then prepare a huge banner with a certain slogan that triggers them in a positive, provocative, but also understandable way for the masses, then this would be a very good way to also basically infiltrate yourself into the public debate.
Yeah, and one of the issues with Americans going out there is that even if they go out there to counter protest, the media will then blame them as instigating the riots. There was a few news stories because, as you were mentioning earlier in the podcast, that there was all these powerful liberal politicians and journalists who are saying that the riots were actually caused by white supremacists, even though Antifa are obviously that's like their whole goal in life, is opposing anyone who may be like that, or that they claim is a white nationalist. That our right extremists were the ones taking the blame. And if there's any right winger who's there even just to observe or to counter protest, that then would claim that this person is the one instigating all the riots and the violence, as was seen in a couple cases here. So that was one reason not to be cautious about going. And there is a good example seeing in the UK, as these football clubs are or as we Americans would call them, soccer fan clubs, are going and protecting some of the statues and saying that you're not going to touch, the cenotaph, you're not going to touch Winston Churchill statue. These are our statues, and you better stay away. And there's been a few cases of them detaining people who are trying to go up and cause violence or deface the statues, and them like bringing on the police and doing a pretty effective job at it. So there is a groundswell of populist energy going into protecting them. I'm not sure if that would happen necessarily in America because there is a different, understanding of Confederate statues and even Columbus statues versus something that is deeply remembered and adored in some of these British communities and in German communities and everything like that. That there's a different understanding there, and also people. We've also had more violent rioting, and I think a lot of Americans who are very upset about this are worried that they're going to get their head bashed in, and police aren't going to do anything, as has happened in numerous cases. And, going back, you were offering some advice earlier about what people could do, such as, as a way that the protesters can't touch you. And there's a very understandable way that you're not the one inspiring riots and violence, such as dropping a banner on a bridge or from a hotel room that they're starting to pass by and sending out a counter message. What is some other advice in general that you offer to American nationalists about how they can get their message out, how they can organize, and how they can effectively challenge the left-wing paradigm?
I would say they have to learn from our political enemy, because if you look at the left, there's a big array of literature and strategic thought process from the left about how to organize, how to build up ground game, and how to create activist force and metapolitical capital. So that's what I would advise to people. Read books of Gene Sharp, Sria Popovich, and those people and those thinkers of non-violent revolution, non-violent action, and you can learn from them how to create metapolitical strength and force. I think that, as you said, like demonstrating, just going out in the street, it can be actually harmful and counterproductive, because it gives the media, it gives the police people that they can persecute, that they can put the blame on. But if you have small and very well trained forces of elite activists who can perform creative and peaceful actions, then I think you could create a lot of very good and very effective resistance. The most important thing, I think, is to get out of the internet and try to locally connect with like-minded people, and to create small, peaceful local cells of patriots where everybody who disagrees with what's going on and happening can join and can get active. Because I think the biggest problem we have right now in the right wing all across the Western world is we have an abundance of info war. We have an abundance of medias, podcasts, videos, outlets, magazines, and so on. But if one actually wants to do something and get active, there are almost no calls to action. There are almost no possibilities to really do something. I think that's driving a lot of people crazy. It's also driving them to crazy deeds and stupid things. And I think only if we overcome this and create movements and organization where everybody who watches those videos and listens to those podcasts can get active, then we also can really create political change.
Yeah, and there is a few examples of that in America. I think one of the important aspects is creating a sense of community in the real world and networking with like-minded people. And this can lead to many beneficial aspects, even if somebody is doxxed, that like it creates a network where people can find them another job or can help support them in that times of crisis. And people really do want to meet like-minded people in person, like, because most people that they interact with or have these really awful normie opinions, as a lot of people in America were complaining, every time that they went to Facebook over the time of the riots, they were seeing their normie friends that they thought they might have been conservative or weren't that like left wing, were posting the most atrocious comments about Black Lives Matter and how much in pain they are at the death of George Floyd, and how white people need to check their privilege. And these were people that they saw as not as left-wing radicals, or they just saw them as normies who may have had their politics may have leaned to the left. And they're seeing people like this. And for people's own sake of sanity, they need to be like, I am not the crazy one here. There are other people who are like-minded, who are normal, who are, productive members of society, who are not trying to, do anything crazy or anything like that, who think like me, who understand that there's something wrong going on here. I want to challenge that and want to create positive change in the world. And I do, and there's some challenges more in America just because we're so spread out. There's so much empty space around us that, and say in Europe that people may be only like an hour distance away. In America, they might be 12 hours distance away, and that there are and that might be the only people who would share these political views in that state or something like that. So there are some unique challenges in America with creating the networks and communities that we want to have in order to build up infrastructures to create the positive change we want. But I think over time that America will adopt a lot of the models that we're seeing in Europe and adapt it to our own particular circumstances. So I think that is overall pretty good advice. And I think that most of this interview has offered a lot of insight for our American listeners. And, Martin, as I always like to emphasize, how best can Americans find you and support you?
I have an English YouTube channel. It's called Martin Sellner, GI for Generation Identity. And also on this channel, they find a link to a Telegram channel where we list all the actions done by European groups. And I think if you need some inspiration, especially if you're a listener and you want to do something yourself, you're part of a patriotic movement, I have a series on my YouTube channel. It's called Action Report, where I interview young identitarian activists from across Europe about big actions they have been performing, like in Lyon. They made a laser projection action against Muslim prayer calls. In Denmark, they had a huge banner drop in a ghetto area. So if you want to get to know those activists and get to know the actions, that's the place to go.
Oh, terrific. And thanks for coming on the podcast today. This has been an incredible discussion. We'll have to have you on again soon, possibly when the coronavirus is where not everybody's locked down and you're able to do a little bit more demonstration. So thanks for coming on and keep up the good work in Europe. And we appreciate your work.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And until next time, stay respected.